Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Techshift F9 podcast. I'm your host, Maurizio, and this is the podcast that talks about career transformations, career paths, and interesting careers in general. It's amazing guests to share their own paths and how they went about their careers in very different industries and fields. This week, I'm super excited about having the one and only Claudia Curran join us. Claudia is the CEO and founder of Linear Impact, an executive life coaching service provider. And she has a long and distinguished career in finance that I just can't wait to pick apart a little bit and ask a lot of questions about. And so, Claudia, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Claudia, let's start from the top here. You had a fairly long career in finance. You spent 9 years on the sell side and 9 years on the buy side, if I'm correct, thereabouts.
That's
Uh,
right. Yep.
and for listeners, I have to emphasize that's not that usual. It's actually already in itself quite a big shift in my mind because obviously the dynamics of those work environments are quite different. But it is a fairly long period of time that has gone through the global financial crisis, a lot of other crises, a lot
Yeah.
of changes, right? I don't want to bring up bad memories, but just generally in your finance career, I mean, how did the world around you professionally change, and how did you change with that?
So we're jumping in with a really big question straight
Oh,
off. I love
all
it.
my
Love it.
questions are big.
I know. So you're right. So I started investment banking in 2000, and at that time it was the very peak of the dot-com ride. So it's
Oh,
crazy to
yes.
think about that journey. So in 2000, it was the first kind of www dot companies that were making a bang. And if you think to where we are today, it's just mind blowing. So it has been quite a journey. And like you mentioned, I started off my career on the sell side in the equities division, and then after 9 years, I moved to the buy side. So there are obviously changes within that culturally, just from sell side to buy side. And then, of course, as you mentioned, my own personal changes as one has more experience and you get greater seniority and responsibility that comes with time. But we take your question on the professional side, world changing first. I think, reflecting back when I first started in 2000, there really wasn't as much emphasis in terms of compliance and regulatory focus. The world was far more old school then in terms of business was very much done on the basis of relationships. It was all about relationships, really, right? So, just to take a micro example of how that played out, if you look at entertainment there, kind of entertainment of clients, and you compare it to today, it's crazy because there was pretty much no cap on spending then if you were taking your clients out, for dinner and going out as an investment bank. Whereas when I left 18 years later, it was a very different world. There was accountability. Payments to banks was to clients was really on the basis of the merits of the quality of research and how much value are they providing to the fund managers process. Whereas before, the world was a lot more gray. Business was given to best relationships, which did not necessarily correlate to the value provided, right? So I think that correction definitely needed to happen. And obviously, like you said, there are so many different other things that we can dive into just in terms of the environment and the economy. But I think if we look at how did I change with it, I don't think I was intentionally changing with the environment as it was changing. And it's certainly not what made me move from the sell side to the buy side. That wasn't a factor. But if I look at how did I really change over those 18 years, rather than being influenced by the environment and landscape, I think I was far more influenced actually by bosses and mentors over the years.
Right.
Because I think, on a day to day basis, you don't necessarily notice the big structural environment changes that are taking place. It's only now, with the benefit of hindsight, that you look across and you're like, wow, that was actually, a really important moment in time. But I don't think that back then you necessarily noticed. And I most certainly, anyway, didn't plan my career accordingly. I didn't have that level of awareness and foresight, let's just say. But so I think it was more mentors and bosses who really influenced me. And I'm happy to kind of talk a bit more about that if that's of interest.
Yeah, why don't we do that? I think personally, I've come across some great bosses, some not so great ones.
Mhm.
But generally, the environment when I was on the sell side, so capital markets, just like you, I was on the debt side, you were on the equity side, but
Yeah.
no real difference. The situation we lived for a lot of our long period of our careers, I think, was one where people's work in those environments were really with a big potential conflict of interest with the interest of the company itself, right? We were out to make a lot of money for ourselves, and that created an environment where it was not easy to come across, good mentoring and good support from the top because yeah, right now you're an asset to that person, but tomorrow you could be, a liability to that person, but still an asset or an even better asset to the firm. Where I'm going with that is obviously it's a lot to do with personalities. I mean, you're a lady. I'm sure it was not that easy to be on a training floor full of men for many years. But how did you find the good mentors and the good bosses in your career?
I think you are so spot on. I think, again, it's only with the benefit of hindsight that I realized, gosh, actually, as a young girl, and I was a girl, right? 21, of just starting out on the equities trading floor, very male dominated. Like, I didn't realize, oh, I really was a minority because back then it was, I mean, my attitude was it was normal. You just show up, you get on with it. It was, that was just part of the deal and part of the job. But it's only looking back now, I realize, oh, the lack of confidence that I felt on day one, those feelings of imposter syndrome, which I had a lot of. I was on the client management side, so I wasn't in a front producing role of like being a trader and a salesperson. And again, to your point, I think if you look back then, who was rewarded and promoted, it's the highest producers, right? So for me, I was on the graduate program and then I decided to go into the management side of the business rather than being, front facing of sales and trading. And so I had to deal with kind of imposter thoughts of that, whilst most of my class went into sales and trading. And then being a female and being so young as well. And my first boss then, how he really influenced me was he was COO and he was also my direct boss. And he definitely, with my confidence, he told me not to discount my unique strengths and values. And I was very quick to discount my natural ability to develop relationships and connect, for example. Whereas I was thinking, well, everybody can do that. That's not a strength. That's nothing to be proud of, right? I'm not able to trade and and he told me, well, actually, what I was taking a lot for granted, not everyone can do. And it was, he just would highlight very what seemed to me small initially. But then when he realized, as we went into meetings, etc., how I was, because of my style of questioning or being very active and listening, very empathetic. And also, to be honest, back then I was probably more active in listening, partly because of the imposter syndrome. I didn't want to like speak up because I didn't want to mess up. But after we would come back and dissect the meeting, I had picked up things that he hadn't, right? I had picked up the real kind of pain points of the clients or what they were really concerned by. And he would show that back to me. He would say, hey, you picked this up that nobody else did, and there's huge value in that. And so slowly, slowly, he kind of like built my confidence for me to really recognize, okay, maybe I don't have, the natural strength or obvious talents that 95% of the trading floor demonstrate, but that's actually a really great thing. And that's what makes me unique, right? So that was definitely one for me who stood out early in my career. And I think, that being when I looked around on the trading floor, when I looked at who were the role models, the other female MDs back then, not to generalize, but they were the ones, the ones who would be promoted to managing director. They were the ones who had really kind of top sales, right? Top revenue. And so by nature, they were the ones who kind of had this alpha energy, who were direct, who were aggressive in getting business, not afraid to make them ask, and which is fabulous, but just not me. And so I really felt like this kind of, oh my gosh, in order to be successful, that's how I have to look. If I want to have a successful career in banking, that's who I need to aspire to be. And that again kind of really created that dissonance in me of that kind of imposter feelings of like, oh, and so that's where the mentors for me shaped me in really recognizing, hey, that's not necessarily the case. Find your own voice and recognizing my strength and talents in helping nurture that. Yeah.
And Claudia, when you moved to the buy side, did you
Hmm.
feel that the environment around you was a little bit more supportive or allowed you to flex that talent that you had that might have not been as apparent, at least to your peers, as you just mentioned on the sell side? And the reason I ask is because when people look at finance, they think, oh, we'll do the same thing. And I think it's true for many industries. But when you look at how companies operate, even the same space, they can operate so differently from one to another. And so
Absolutely.
I'd love to hear your thoughts and experience on that.
Yeah, culturally it's very different as you know, right? The buy side to sell side, it's a faster pace. But I don't think for me it's necessarily comparing apples with apples because it was 9 years later. So I moved in, and by that stage, in the buy side, I was a managing director. I moved to Singapore to set up the Asia office. So, whereas on the sell side, I was junior, I was in this trading floor with this whole big machine behind you. And on the buy side, it was just me. I was starting up the office. I then, over the next 9 years, built it to manage $1 billion of exposure. We had, 8 different teams. So it's different in the sense that, the sell side, I was at the bottom of the food chain. And when I started at the buy side, I was the top of the food chain. So it's a little bit different. But I think, going back to just being more general in terms of how that can affect one's feelings of stress and comparison, when you're in the sell side, it's just a lot more competitive, right? Because there are so many people. But I would say that the buy side, again, there are different firms. There are different firms where they like to pitch one team against the other
Right.
and have weekly accountability of performance numbers. So if you're a female fund manager or a female analyst on the buy side, is it any different to the sell side, right? It's maybe a different environment. But so I think to your point, it's far more important to find a company with a good cultural fit that's aligned with your personality. And I think that's something that I most certainly didn't think about. When I started my career, it was just a matter of like, oh, I need to get a job. And I wanted to be with one of the blue chip companies. It's got to be Goldman's or Merrill's or I never thought about asking about the culture. It was like, just who's going to give me a job, right? And so, and so that's certainly now when I work with clients, a lot of times, a lot of my clients, if they're burnt out and stressed, yes, we want to, strengthen them internally so that, so that they know how to handle stress and they recognize what's causing them stress. But equally, there are times when it could just be that you're not in good alignment with the company, right? And so no matter how much you change in your thinking, if it's just not a good cultural fit, it's never going to work. And so I think that's another very important thing for us when we're looking for our career or looking for which firm to join, that to recognize the interview process, it's about them getting to know us. But what's just as important is this is a chance for us to get to know them, right? How do they look at talent? How do they look at nurturing people's career path? How do they handle a mistake, or if you're not performing in the next 6 months, what's their process? And we don't, I think, in general, take enough advantage of that in the interview process to do our own fact finding.
I completely agree, Corey. And I think even ahead of the interview process, just to try and understand how companies operate, because it's really all about people. But you touched upon your move from London to Singapore. You are an international kid, if I may say so, with a varied background. How was that change, though? Obviously, professionally is a little bit different than personally when you go to a new country, new place. How did you handle that? How did that perhaps help your own professional development?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I am pretty what do they call it? A third generation kid. I was born in Hong Kong. My father's Swiss, my mother's Chinese. I went to boarding school in the UK, and then Scotland for university, and then worked in London for 9 years, and then came and then moved out to Singapore. So for me, it wasn't a big deal. In many ways, I was going back to home. I'm far more in probably many ways Asian, even though I don't look Asian at all. Nobody can even guess that I'm half Chinese. But I think how it helped me is I have this just innate awareness that it's not a one size fits all in any situation, right? That whilst it's all very well to be an expert in one area or the best at one thing, if you go into a situation, say in Asia, with zero awareness that you're in a totally different environment, then even though you might be the best at something, that can be easily redundant if you don't have the cultural awareness factor. Because for me, at the end of the day, everything in business comes down to two things: trust and value, right? Like that's how I like
I
to
like that.
think. Yeah. And so value might be having the best product, but if there is no trust in the relationship, then there's no success, right? So the two have to be there. And trust can be easily eroded through miscommunication. And so for me, that kind of internationalism, as you called it, is what helped me to build that level of trust in a natural way, right? Because when people can identify themselves with someone, that automatically increases the level of trust because they're thinking, oh, this person understands me. This person understands what's important to me, right? They understand how I operate and how I think. And that's when then people open up and then you can deliver the product and service. So for me, yes, I think that's where it kind of really helped me.
Got it. And Claire, we have to talk about your pivot into life and executive coaching. Now, offline, we had a conversation about it. I loved it. I'm going to need to ask you to perhaps give us a bit of a summary of your moment and how that happened and why and how you're finding your new, but your recent pivot.
Yeah, so in between that kind of time between the sell side and buy side, I actually took a year off for maternity leave with my first child. And 3 months into my maternity leave, my husband of 1 year was diagnosed with leukemia. And what he had was so aggressive that he had a 50-50 chance of survival in that first 12 months, and he needed a bone marrow transplant as soon as possible. So we were super lucky. He found a donor and he had the transplant. And I was actually 6 months pregnant at the time. And 3 months later, I unfortunately lost our baby girl on my due date. And the next year, I thought I was being resilient and strong and looking forward. And what I didn't really realize was that I was completely avoiding my emotions. So I thought I was being resilient and strong in the sense that we were still dealing with his recovery. And after a year, when he started to stabilize, I thought, okay, I know what's happened and we have to look forward in life. And so I'm going to get a job. And that's where I started the role with the buy side. And I said, I'm going to look forward. So I thought I was being really kind of strong and resilient, right? And actually, what happened was I then started to have a little bit of general anxiety, which then grew to chronic anxiety. And that turned into panic attacks. And the panic attacks started becoming almost like on a daily basis. And this went on for 8 years. And I tried all sorts of things in those 8 years. I tried breathing. I would go to escapes, health retreats. I would do girls' weekends. and nothing worked, or things might help for a little bit, but the anxiety would always come back. And so one day I thought I was having a heart attack at the car park, and I called my secretary and I said, "Listen, you've got to call me, call the ambulance." And it wasn't a heart attack; it was just an off the chart panic attack. But at that point, I thought, okay, I really need to do something now. And I just, as fate would have it, I just happened to find a life coach who was trained as a psychologist. And she really changed my life around in the sense that for the first time ever, I learned about my brain and how it worked. And in doing so, it changed my relationship with anxiety, with fear. And I then realized, gosh, I had to wait until I was 40 years old to figure this out. Why isn't this being taught at school? And the more a little bit, like when you come out for the first time as like an addict, or, the more I started, I kept this a secret, by the way. Nobody
Right.
knew. So the whole time I was running the hedge fund, everybody thought I was, on top of the world. But inside, they had no idea that my world was crumbling. And so the more I started to open up and tell people that actually I was having these daily panic attacks and it was crippling my life, people would then say, "Oh, my husband or my wife or my colleague, can you speak to my daughter?" And I just realized, gosh, we still, even though there's so much talk about mental health, people still don't really understand the practicalities of where do I start, right? What does it mean and how do I do it? And so I think it's Tony Robbins who has that quote, your mess becomes your message. I think that's certainly what happened with me. I suddenly thought, oh, I felt for the first time, this is what I'm meant to do. I'm meant to just, if I can even help one person cut down their journey from what I went through over 8 years and give people tools, then everything becomes meaningful. And so that's why I decided to pivot into life coaching. And so I work with executives and corporates. And I call myself a general life coach because we do everything from leadership coaching to business coaching. But,
Right.
the mental health aspect is almost for me just foundational stuff, because it's like if you're not grounded in your body, then you definitely can't be physically, right? So I always kick off with all my clients that at the beginning, and then we kind of coach on anything and everything beyond that.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you for sharing something quite personal like that. But I think it's very empowering and I think very well, inspiring too. But clearly now you're running a business. It's great to help people, but you've got to make ends meet. And it's although you've been running businesses in the context of large financial organizations, I assume this was the first time for you to actually run your own business. How's that learning process been? How's that experience been? Has it been, I mean, I know that the work you're doing means a lot to you, and it's obviously you care so much about it, but there are aspects of the business that maybe not just as fun. So how's that experience been for you?
Yeah, I was a bit naive. I kind of thought, build it and they will come. So
Right.
I thought after doing a year of certification, that the minute I, hung the sign outside the door of, open for business, that miraculously clients would just appear. And that wasn't the case, in the sense that I realized I had a lot of new skill sets that I had to learn. That being able to coach was one thing, but growing a business is a completely different kettle of fish. And so that's been really exciting because I realized, in a way, going to Singapore and setting up the hedge fund from like I said, zero, right? I do have this entrepreneurial spirit in me. And so I think that's, put me in good stead of just kind of like saying, okay, problem solving. It's like, okay, I need to learn about marketing. I need to learn about copywriting. I need to learn how to sell. And so, yeah, there were a lot of new skill sets that I had to develop. And coaching, I thought, was the biggest thing, being a good coach, but actually, that's just half the battle,
Right.
right? But for me, it's been really enjoyable. But obviously, again, entrepreneurship is not necessarily for everyone, because I would say there were a lot of days where, thankfully, I had tools in my toolbox in terms of what to do, when there were months where, for example, I would have my highest peaking month and then nothing for the next 2 months. And there it's very easy to then potentially spiral and go, oh gosh, I'm not any good at this. It's business is not going to happen, and then maybe fold up shop and go in house or something. And I think that's the biggest danger of failure. It's about giving up, right? It's not the fact that you necessarily failed. It's the fact that you're going to potentially give up. And that, luckily, I have tools in the toolkit for that. But I had to heavily rely on those in terms of building the business, and really kind of do a lot of growth and almost detach myself from the results, right?
Right.
Because I think that's what most of us make it mean. It's like, oh, I've hit this many new clients, I must be a good coach, or I must be a success. And so I've really enjoyed that, and it's only just the beginning. So watch this
Absolutely.
space.
And Claudia, actually, in a course I teach at a local university here about startups, entrepreneurship, I always tell my students, look, you have to separate your business persona from
Yeah,
yourself, because otherwise there's there are too many emotions. But the reality is when you go into entrepreneurship, particularly from a large organization, where you relied on, I don't want to say hundreds, but definitely a deep bench of people supporting you in all the ancillary services, to being almost on your own and having to rely perhaps on friends and family, on your network. And it is, as you said, it's not for everyone, but I think the path is pretty straightforward, right? I mean, it's all about planning, doing your numbers. Businesses run on money, so you got to run your numbers. You got to have a strategy for getting clients. I mean, and all these things you sort of knew how to do, or you had some degree of experience because of that big corporate world experience. So would you say that you've brought out over a lot of your experience and talent and skills into what you're doing from your previous work?
absolutely. And I think that's, definitely one thing, again, most of us don't recognize is how many transferable skills we already have. And even if you might be just starting out the job for the first time, going, well, I have nothing to transfer over. It's like, that's not true, right? Maybe you were, I don't know, captain of the basketball team growing up. There, you probably just didn't recognize, but how many skills did you develop in that role that you can bring into your new situation? And I think, going from the sell side, like you said, it was easy in the sense that there were experts everywhere. So when you were meeting a client and you were pitching something and you didn't know the answer, it was easy to find the solution, right? You just had to look internally. And then going to the buy side, being alone and not having this big corporate machine of just picking up the phone and figuring out who to call. At first, I was thinking, oh my gosh, what do I do here? But to your point, I then realized that actually it's no different. When I was in the sell side, I was working at a city, and city, retail investment banking. I mean, there are a lot of people, a lot of resources. And I still had to figure out who was the right person within
Of
this
course.
organization, right? And using the network internally. And so now, in setting up the hedge fund in Singapore, my network was looking different. To your point, it was pulling in friends, it was pulling in, people from LinkedIn, but the process was no different. And when I realized that, it was like, oh, I've got this, I can do this. And I think to your point, maybe the best learning for or best tip or advice for people starting out is to fully expect that to be the case, because I think that's probably the biggest shock factor when most of us aren't necessarily anticipating it. And like I said, I was a bit naive of like, okay, I'm open for business, and I just thought there would be this line of clients outside. And so, it's to your point of the planning, like you just need to anticipate it, because when you anticipate it and fully expect it, then you can organize your mindset, you can create a plan for it. It's just not a problem. It's just a maths problem to be solved, right? It means nothing about you or if you're doing well or not. You can just go into kind of CEO mindset and figuring it out.
Totally. Claudia, we don't have a lot of time left, but I need to ask you one more question. Uh, what's ahead for you? What are the goals that you set for yourself over the next few years?
Yeah, so for me at the moment, I'm working with clients very much on a one-on-one basis. And so a short-term goal is I want to make this more accessible. So over the last 5 years, I've been refining my process. And I work with emerging leaders on elevating their presence without feeling like an imposter so they can create meaningful impact. And over the last 5 years, I've now got my process bedded down with a proven track record. And so I want to turn this into a digital program so that it can be far more accessible, that it's not just for the ones who can afford, because, one-on-one coaching can be an investment. So that's my focus in the short term. In the longer term, I do want to look at potentially figuring out how I can work with the younger generation, maybe the children, because I just see mental health in today's environment with social media and all just so many different, pressure points than when you and I were growing up, and they're just not equipped for it. And so I would love to explore that space in the longer term of being able to just share some tools and concepts and have people start having that awareness so that people don't have to wait until they're 40 and having daily panic attacks like myself to realize actually there are tools, and just learning and understanding how your brain operates can make a huge difference to you, to your mental well-being.
Claudia, this has been terrific. Loved having you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, folks, that's the end of another episode. Thank you for listening. Stay cool, stay positive.